April 17, 1970. The East Room of the White House. Johnny Cash stood before President Richard Nixon, the most powerful man in the world, holding a guitar and a decision that could destroy his career. Nixon had summoned him here for a reason, to perform two specific songs that would help the president's political agenda. Songs that painted protesters as traitors and welfare recipients as lazy criminals. Conservative anthems that Nixon wanted delivered by country music's biggest star to legitimize his silent majority campaign. The president's chief of staff had made the requests crystal clear. Okie from Muskogee and Welfare Cadillac. Songs Johnny Cash had never recorded, had never performed, and frankly despised for their simplistic hatred disguised as patriotism. Nixon sat in the front row, smiling confidently, certain that the man in black would do what he was told. After all, you don't say no to the President of the United States. But Johnny Cash was about to prove that some things matter more than political power, and what he did next would become the most defiant act of his career. Before we witness the moment Johnny Cash told the president to go to hell without saying a word, tell me, what city are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments, because this story about moral courage and refusing to be a political puppet is something we desperately need right now. Here's the question that'll define your character. If the most powerful person in your world ordered you to promote something you found morally repugnant, would you comply to protect your career, or would you stand your ground, knowing the consequences could be devastating? Johnny Cash faced exactly that choice in front of cameras, dignitaries, and the president himself. And if this story inspires you to find your own spine, hit that subscribe button. We're about to witness what integrity looks like when it's tested by power. The invitation to perform at the White House arrived in March 1970, and Johnny Cash's first instinct was to decline. He'd spent the past 2 years deliberately distancing himself from political manipulation, refusing to let either party claim him as a spokesman for their agenda. His ABC television variety show had made him a household name beyond country music circles, but it had also made him a target for politicians who saw his popularity as something they could exploit. Both Democrats and Republicans had approached him about endorsements, appearances, statements supporting their positions. Johnny had rejected them all, understanding that the moment you become a political tool, you stop being an artist and become just another voice in the propaganda machine. But declining a White House invitation wasn't simple. It was a statement in itself, one that would be interpreted politically regardless of his actual reasons. His manager argued for accepting, pointing out that performing for the president was an honor, a career milestone, something that would cement Johnny's status as a cultural icon. June Carter Cash, his wife and artistic partner, was less certain. She knew Johnny's instincts about political manipulation were usually right, that his gut-level resistance to this invitation probably meant something. But she also knew that refusing could bring consequences. Nixon wasn't known for forgiving perceived slights, and the machinery of government could make life difficult for someone who publicly rejected the president's hospitality. After days of debate, Johnny agreed to perform, but with one condition that his manager had to communicate clearly to the White House advance team. He would choose his own set list. No requests, no suggestions. He'd perform Johnny Cash songs that represented Johnny Cash's values, and if that wasn't acceptable, he wouldn't come. The White House agreed immediately, which should have been Johnny's first warning that something wasn't right. What Johnny didn't know, what he wouldn't discover until he arrived in Washington, was that the White House had already announced to the press which songs Johnny Cash would perform. The president's communications director had issued a statement saying that Mr. Cash would perform Okie from Muskogee and Welfare Cadillac, two songs that perfectly aligned with Nixon's political messaging. Okie from Muskogee, Merle Haggard's conservative anthem about small-town values and disdain for hippies and protesters, had become an unofficial theme song for Nixon's silent majority, the Americans who supposedly supported the Vietnam War and opposed the counterculture. Welfare Cadillac, Guy Drake's song mocking welfare recipients and suggesting they were lazy criminals living off hard-working taxpayers, fit Nixon's narrative about government waste and the undeserving poor. Both songs were weapons in Nixon's culture war, and he wanted Johnny Cash to deliver them with his credibility and authenticity. The problem, the catastrophic miscalculation that Nixon's team had made, was that Johnny Cash had never recorded either song, had never performed either song, and considered both songs to be simplistic, hateful garbage that represented everything wrong with American political discourse. Okie from Muskogee reduced complex issues about war and generational change into us versus them tribalism. Welfare Cadillac demonized poor people based on racist stereotypes and willful ignorance about how poverty actually worked. These weren't Johnny's values. They weren't his message. They were the opposite of everything he'd been trying to say through his music about compassion, understanding, and recognizing humanity in people that society had written off. When Johnny arrived at the White House on April 17th and saw the press releases announcing his planned set list, he realized he'd been set up. The East Room was filled with carefully selected guests, conservative donors, Republican lawmakers, military officers, people who would appreciate Nixon's silent majority messaging and who expected Johnny Cash to deliver it. The president himself sat in the front row with the First Lady, Pat Nixon, both wearing practiced political smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Behind them, rows of chairs held the powerful and connected, people who'd probably never listened to a Johnny Cash album, but who understood his symbolic value. This wasn't a concert. It was a political rally disguised as cultural appreciation, and Johnny was supposed to be the entertainment, the country music minstrel performing on command for his betters. The realization made him furious in ways that his legendary temper rarely reached anymore, a cold, clarifying rage that demanded response. H.R. Haldeman, Nixon's chief of staff, approached Johnny before the performance with the confident assumption that everything had been arranged. "Mr. Cash, the president is particularly looking forward to Okie from Muskogee and Welfare Cadillac. If you could perform those first, it would be ideal for the timing of the evening." Haldeman's tone wasn't requesting, it was informing, the voice of someone used to being obeyed without question. Johnny looked at him for a long moment, and June, standing beside him, recognized the expression on her husband's face. It was the look he got right before he did something that couldn't be taken back, right before he chose principle over pragmatism, regardless of cost. "I don't know those songs," Johnny said flatly, his voice carrying none of the warmth he usually showed in public interactions. Haldeman blinked, momentarily confused. "I'm sorry?" "The press office confirmed—" Johnny cut him off, his voice harder now, the tone he used when his patience was exhausted. "I don't know those songs. I've never recorded them. I've never performed them. I don't sing other people's material on request, especially when those songs promote hatred and ignorance. I'll perform my own songs, the ones I actually believe in, or I'll leave right now." The threat was clear and absolutely serious. Haldeman's face went through several expressions, surprise, anger, calculation, before settling on practiced diplomatic neutrality. "Mr. Cash, the president specifically requested—" "Then the president was misinformed by whoever told him I'd perform those songs. I'm here to sing Johnny Cash songs. If that's not acceptable, I can be back in Nashville in 4 hours." The confrontation was happening in a side room, away from the assembled guests and press, but voices were rising enough that Secret Service agents were shifting uncomfortably, uncertain about their role in a conflict between a White House official and a performer. Haldeman excused himself, disappeared for maybe 3 minutes, then returned with a forced smile that looked like it physically hurt. "The president says he looks forward to whatever you choose to perform, Mr. Cash. We appreciate your artistic integrity." The words were correct, but the tone suggested that Johnny had just made an enemy of one of the most powerful men in Washington. Johnny didn't care. He'd already decided that maintaining his integrity was worth whatever consequences followed. When Johnny Cash walked into the East Room to perform, the applause was polite but not enthusiastic. These weren't his fans, they were political operatives and donors using culture as another battlefield. He carried his guitar, stood before the microphone without introduction or fanfare, and made a decision in real time about what message to send. He could play it safe, perform his biggest hits, give them an entertaining show that avoided politics entirely. Or he could use this platform, this moment when he had the president's attention and a room full of powerful people, to say what he actually believed, regardless of how they'd react. Johnny Cash had never been good at playing it safe. The first song he performed wasn't on any set list, wasn't one of his radio hits, and definitely wasn't what Nixon wanted to hear. It was What Is Truth, a song Johnny had written specifically about the generation gap, about understanding young people protesting the war and questioning authority, about recognizing that the old answers weren't working anymore and maybe it was time to listen instead of condemn. The lyrics were deliberately provocative. The young man speaking in the city square is trying to tell somebody that he cares. Yeah, the ones who call him crazy are not sure they really know. It was everything Okie from Muskogee wasn't: empathetic instead of dismissive, questioning instead of certain, asking listeners to consider that maybe the protesters had valid points. The room's temperature dropped about 20 degrees as people realized what Johnny was doing. Nixon's smile became fixed, frozen. A political mask that didn't slip but didn't warm either. Some guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, uncertain whether they were supposed to applaud this implicit criticism of the president's policies. Others sat stone-faced, arms crossed, radiating disapproval that Johnny could feel from the stage, but deliberately ignored. He sang every verse with conviction, made eye contact with the audience, forced them to actually hear the lyrics instead of treating the performance as background noise. When the song ended, the applause was scattered and confused. Some people clapped out of politeness, others because they'd actually listened and found themselves moved despite their political allegiances. But Johnny wasn't finished. He'd started down this road, and there was no turning back now. The second song was The Ballad of Ira Hayes, Peter Lafarge's devastating story about the Native American Marine who'd helped raise the flag at Iwo Jima, became a war hero, and then returned home to die drunk and forgotten on his reservation because America celebrated his sacrifice but denied his humanity. The song was a direct indictment of American hypocrisy, of how the country used minorities when convenient but abandoned them when they needed support. It criticized everything Nixon's silent majority supposedly stood for: uncomplicated patriotism, military glorification without acknowledging consequences, the myth that America always took care of its heroes. And Johnny sang it standing 10 feet from the President of the United States, making absolutely clear that he wouldn't be anyone's political puppet. Nixon's jaw was clenched now, his politician's smile completely abandoned. Haldeman, sitting 2 rows back, looked like he was calculating how quickly they could end this performance and get Johnny Cash out of the White House. But they couldn't stop it. The cameras were rolling, the press was present, and cutting off a performance would create a bigger story than letting him finish. So they sat there, trapped by their own publicity stunt, forced to listen as Johnny Cash used their platform to criticize their policies and values. Some guests started leaving quietly, making excuses about other engagements, unwilling to sit through this implicit rebuke of everything they believed. Others stayed, and some of them, the younger staffers, the military officers who'd actually served in Vietnam, the few people in the room who'd experienced real hardship, started listening with genuine attention. June Carter joined Johnny for the third song, The Loving Gift, a gospel number about grace and redemption that had nothing to do with politics, but everything to do with the values Johnny actually held. The contrast was deliberate. After 2 songs criticizing American failures, a song about what America could be if it actually lived up to its stated principles, June's voice harmonizing with Johnny's created something beautiful and sincere that cut through the political tension, reminded everyone that underneath the culture war there were actual human values worth celebrating. For 3 minutes, the room stopped being a political battlefield and became just a space where music happened. When they finished, the applause was warmer, more genuine, people responding to the artistry rather than filtering everything through political calculation. Johnny performed for 30 minutes total, a mix of his hits and deeper cuts, each song chosen deliberately to communicate what he believed rather than what Nixon wanted to hear. He sang Folsom Prison Blues and I Walk the Line, songs that had made him famous. But he also performed Man in Black, his explicit statement about wearing black in protest of injustice, poverty, war, and all the things wrong with America that needed fixing rather than celebrating. The message was unmistakable. I'm not here to validate your politics. I'm here to tell the truth as I see it, and if that makes you uncomfortable, that's exactly the point. When the performance ended, Nixon stood and shook Johnny's hand for the cameras, both men smiling with lips that didn't match their eyes, performing civility while maintaining mutual contempt. "Thank you for the performance, Mr. Cash," Nixon said, his voice flat. "It was educational," Johnny responded with equal ice. "Thank you for the invitation, Mr. President. I hope you learned something." The exchange was brief, professional, and seething with unspoken hostility. Then Johnny and June were escorted out, their White House visit ending with none of the warmth or celebration that usually accompanied such events. The car ride back to their hotel was silent, except for June finally saying what they were both thinking. "Well, you certainly burned that bridge." Johnny laughed, a sound of genuine relief mixed with satisfaction. "Good. Some bridges need burning. They wanted to use me like a trained monkey performing tricks for treats. They wanted Johnny Cash's credibility without Johnny Cash's values. And I showed them that's not how this works." June squeezed his hand, proud and worried simultaneously, knowing that what Johnny had done was courageous and possibly career-destroying. You don't publicly defy the president without consequences, especially when that president was Richard Nixon, who kept an enemies list and had the power of the federal government at his disposal. The media response was immediate and divided exactly along political lines. Conservative outlets crucified Johnny for disrespecting the president, for pushing liberal politics at a cultural event, for being ungrateful for the honor of performing at the White House. Liberal publications celebrated him as a hero, a rare example of an artist refusing to be co-opted by political power, standing up for his principles despite the cost. Country music radio stations started receiving calls, some demanding they stop playing Johnny Cash for his disrespect, others praising him for his integrity. The controversy threatened to overshadow his music entirely, turning him into a political symbol, whether he wanted that or not. But something unexpected happened in the weeks following the White House performance. Johnny's popularity increased. The same audience that had made At Folsom Prison a crossover hit, the outcasts, the misfits, the people who felt like society had written them off, rallied around Johnny even harder. They understood what he'd done at the White House. He'd stood up for them, had refused to perform songs that demonized protesters and poor people, had used his platform to advocate for understanding rather than hatred. Letters poured into his management office, thousands of them, from Vietnam veterans and civil rights activists, from Native Americans and working-class families, all expressing gratitude that someone with his visibility had chosen truth over political convenience. And crucially, Nixon's threatened revenge never materialized in any meaningful way, because the president had his own problems developing, problems that would eventually lead to resignation and disgrace. Years later, when asked about the White House performance, Johnny would say, "They wanted me to sing songs that put people down, that divided Americans into us versus them, that made it easier to hate than to understand, and I just couldn't do it. Not for the president, not for anyone. Music is supposed to bring people together, supposed to help us see each other's humanity. Using it as a weapon to hurt people, that's not what I signed up for." The incident became legendary, though the details were often confused in retellings. Some versions claimed Johnny had stormed out mid-performance. Others suggested he'd been banned from the White House permanently. The truth was simpler and more powerful. He'd been invited to perform propaganda, had refused, and had instead used the platform to say what he actually believed. No drama, no theatrics, just quiet, firm refusal to compromise his values, regardless of who was demanding that compromise. Merle Haggard, who'd written Okie from Muskogee, eventually heard about Nixon's request and Johnny's refusal. His response was telling. "I don't blame Johnny one bit. I wrote that song half as satire anyway, and watching politicians use it like a club to beat people with, that wasn't what I intended." Johnny understood that music has power, and power can be used to hurt or to heal. He chose healing even when the president wanted hurt. The welfare Cadillac songwriter Guy Drake was less gracious, claiming Johnny had missed an opportunity and disrespected the office of the president. But Drake's career faded into obscurity, while Johnny's only grew stronger, suggesting that audiences ultimately reward authenticity over political convenience. The ultimate vindication came in the decades following, as Nixon's presidency collapsed in scandal, and Johnny Cash's legacy solidified as one of American music's most important voices. History remembered Nixon as Watergate, resignation, disgrace. History remembered Johnny Cash as integrity, authenticity, courage. The contrast wasn't accidental. It was the inevitable result of choices both men made about what mattered more: power or principles, political advantage or human dignity, winning or being right. Johnny had chosen principles, and though it had felt risky in that East Room with the president staring at him and powerful people judging him, it turned out to be the only choice that led anywhere worth going. The story of Johnny Cash refusing to perform Okie from Muskogee and Welfare Cadillac for President Nixon became a touchstone for artists facing political pressure, a reminder that you don't have to perform on command just because someone powerful demands it. Musicians dealing with pressure from corporations, politicians, or cultural gatekeepers would reference it. Remember when Johnny told Nixon no? That's what integrity looks like. It established a template for artistic resistance, not loud or performative, but quiet and absolute, refusing to participate in things you find morally wrong regardless of consequences. And the lesson extends beyond music. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is say no to power when power demands you compromise yourself. Johnny Cash stood in the White House and chose his values over presidential approval, chose his audience over political advantage, chose truth over convenience. Richard Nixon ordered him to sing songs of hate. Johnny Cash played songs of understanding instead, and that decision, made in a moment of pressure and consequence, defined his legacy more completely than any hit record or award ever could. The man in black wore black in protest of injustice, and when the President of the United States tried to dress him in different colors, Johnny refused, politely, firmly, and absolutely. That's the story. That's the legacy. That's what it means to have a spine when powerful people expect you to bend,